The chandeliers at Toronto's Fairmont Royal York glittered like frozen fireworks, their crystals scattering golden light across marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen. The ballroom was alive with the hum of Canada's elite, CEOs in tailored suits, wives in gowns that shimmered like rivers of silk, conversations as calculated as business contracts. Each guest was a chess piece, moved carefully into place in Richard Hartwell's annual charity gala, a night designed to project power, wealth, and untouchable perfection. And yet, in the far corner, behind a carved stone column, someone did not fit the pattern. Isabella Hartwell, the daughter of the host, stood in a midnight blue gown that draped to the floor. From a distance she might have looked regal, but closer inspection revealed what most of the room pretended not to see. The right side of her face carried scars that told a story of fire and pain, skin marked permanently by flames that had ended her ballet career 7 years ago. At 24, Isabella moved like a ghost at her own funeral, watching the crowd with eyes that once commanded a stage, but now avoided attention at all costs. Everywhere she went, whispers followed. "That's her," someone would murmur. "The ballerina who burned." People averted their eyes quickly afterward, not out of compassion, but out of discomfort. Her father's empire thrived on appearances, and his daughter's presence tonight was an imperfection he could not entirely erase, but wished to keep out of focus. Richard himself, silver-haired and commanding, moved through the center of the room with the precision of a general. At 58, he radiated control, every gesture rehearsed, every smile calculated, every handshake weighed for influence. His eyes, pale and cold, swept across the ballroom like searchlights cataloging allies and threats. When his gaze brushed past Isabella, he didn't linger. To him, she was furniture. To others, she was tragedy. Nathan Miller saw her differently. 36 years old, he moved among the glittering guests in the black and white uniform of a hotel waiter, balancing trays of champagne with a steadiness that came from years of practice. Broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, but trained to be invisible, Nathan glided from table to table as if part of the decor. Yet, unlike the rest, he noticed the young woman pressed into the shadow of a column, fingers trembling slightly as she clutched a glass she never drank from. Nathan was no stranger to quiet suffering. His wife Amanda had died 3 years ago, a brutal battle with cancer that had stripped not only their savings, but also his dreams. Once, he had been a jazz pianist on the cusp of joining a touring quartet. But when Amanda fell sick, he had abandoned the road, stayed home, and learned how to braid his daughter Lily's hair instead of chasing stages. Now, he played piano in hotel bars at night and served champagne at events like this, trading in melodies and dignity for the sake of survival. Still, music lived inside him, and grief had sharpened his ability to see pain in others. Even when they tried to hide it, the evening unfolded with mechanical grace. Guests laughed too loudly, their flutes of Veuve Clicquot sparkling under the lights. Waiters moved like shadows, reloading glasses before they emptied. On stage, a string quartet played safe arrangements that filled the background, but stirred no emotion. And in that carefully curated environment, Isabella was both invisible and glaringly obvious. Conversations skirted her corner, yet every head turned once in a while, stealing glances that carried pity, cruelty, or curiosity. Nathan's hand brushed against the object in his pocket, a small music box Amanda had given him years ago. Sometimes, unbidden, the box played a few trembling notes, a ghost of melody reminding him of love and loss. Tonight, as he crossed the ballroom, he thought he heard those phantom notes again, though it might have been only memory. And then his eyes found Isabella's once more, her shoulders rigid, her jaw set against a tide of whispers. On the stage, Richard Hartwell climbed the stairs to address his guests. Cameras flashed as he declared the gala's donations would fund new urban housing projects under Hartwell Enterprises' charitable wing. His voice carried across the ballroom, smooth and authoritative, the practiced baritone of a man who had never been contradicted. Applause erupted on cue, every clap a performance in itself. Behind the sound, Isabella remained motionless, a figure both present and excluded. For Nathan, something shifted in that moment. He set his silver tray on a nearby table, ignoring the reprimand he knew would come later. The music from the quartet faded between selections, a hush falling over the room. It was then, in the silence, that Nathan walked straight toward Isabella. The crowd parted slightly, curiosity prickling the air. No one expected a servant to approach the Hartwell heiress, much less in full view of 300 guests. Yet Nathan did not waver. When he reached her, he didn't bow, didn't speak of pity, didn't offer condolences. He simply extended his hand. Warm, steady, patient. The kind of gesture that carried no judgment, only invitation. Gasps spread through the crowd like ripples across water. Some whispered in scandalized delight. Others frowned in disapproval. But every eye fixed on the impossible to blow. A single father in a waiter's uniform daring to ask the scarred daughter of one of Canada's most powerful men for a dance. Isabella's instinct was to recoil. For years she had lived by refusal, shaking her head before anyone could ask, avoiding mirrors, declining opportunities, shrinking into shadows. And so, when Nathan's hand hung in the space between them, her first response was a small, automatic shake of her head. No, not again. Not here. But just as she lowered her gaze, she caught a flicker of movement at the service entrance. A little girl, barely tall enough to peek around the doorframe, waved excitedly. Lily Miller, 7 years old, her hair in uneven braids her father had done quickly before his shift. She was grinning at Isabella as if she were the most beautiful person in the room. The babysitter tried to pull Lily back, but the child's bright smile lingered, untouched by calculation or cruelty. Something in that smile cracked Isabella's armor. For the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to imagine, stepping back into light. Slowly, deliberately, she set her untouched glass on the marble ledge. Her hand, scarred but elegant, lifted toward Nathan's. Gasps became murmurs. Murmurs became silence. And as Nathan's calloused fingers closed gently around hers, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Her fingers in his felt like a question asked in a language she had not spoken since the night. The lights went out. Isabella did not glance at the crowd. She looked only at Nathan's hand, warm, steady, ordinary, and the ordinary felt miraculous, like a door she could step through. For a heartbeat the ballroom blurred. Chandeliers melted into a glittering fog. The marble floor became a sheet of light, and the murmur of Toronto's elite thinned into a single, shimmering note. That note tugged a thread in her memory, and the thread pulled her backward 7 years, a lifetime into the heat. The Riverside Theater had been her kingdom then, not the new, renovated version that glossy magazines would later photograph, but the old brick and limestone shell on Queen Street that smelled like rosin, dust, and possibility. On opening night the lobby had brimmed with people in wool coats shaking snow from their shoulders, maple leaves trapped in scarf fringes. The kind of crowd that smiled at strangers because they were all there for the same miracle. Bodies speaking music. Isabella had been the headliner, Canada's brightest young ballerina. The feature in the Toronto Star had called her a phrase that made her blush. And work harder in equal measure. Backstage, she'd laced her shoes at the wooden bench by the mirror lined with warm bulbs. Her partner had teased her about double knotting. You tie them like you're afraid of losing them. And she had laughed. Because that was true. She had lost so much already. Summers, parties, the messy ordinary of teenage life. The sacrifice felt holy. She had offered it to the stage like incense. A whisper of smoke writhed first thin as a thread, so faint she thought it was hairspray. Then a cough from one of the lighting techs. Then a second. By the time someone shouted for a fire extinguisher, a blossom of orange unfurled above the flies. Petals of heat falling in slow, terrible grace. Later, she would learn the words for it. Faulty wiring, compromised rigging, emergency sprinklers temporarily offline. Later, she would see the reports, 3 of them signed and ignored. But in the moment there was only instinct. Isabella had stepped out of her dressing room because someone was crying down the corridor. It was one of the youngest girls, barely 12, frozen at the sight of sparks drifting like malevolent fireflies. Come here, Isabella had said, voice steady, hands held open. The girl ran, and Isabella turned to shepherd others toward the stage door. On stage, the backdrop collapsed like a curtain call from hell. Synthetic fabric, hot and sticky, clung as if it had a will. She did not remember pain at first, just pressure, weight, the smell of burning plastic, the taste of something bitter and electric. When the nerves woke, they came back as knives. Her right cheek, her jaw, her hands everywhere. She had tried to shield the child lit with a pain so bright it went silent. She remembered seeing her palm, upturned and blistered, and thinking absurdly of the line from class, "Present your hand to the audience like a gift." This was not a gift. This was a brand. She woke later under hospital fluorescence, everything to white, to clean, to loud. The pain fought through sedation in waves. A nurse with kind eyes touched her shoulder, but the room seemed crowded with suits, men and women who spoke in low, soothing tones that were not soothing at all. Her father arrived with them, not in a coat but in a shield of certainty. He stood near the bed as if the space had been built for him, and the doctor's good people. She believes that deferred to the gravity of his voice. "We'll handle the communications," he told a public relations man with a tablet. "No names. We keep it compassionate and concise. An unfortunate accident. The theater will cover everything. The theater. Not my daughter. Not Isabella." From that bed, with gauze mapping her face and morphine fogging her breath, she learned the first rule of her father's version of love. What cannot be controlled must be contained. The official story landed in the papers 2 days later like snow that never melted. An electrical mishap. A perfect storm. Thoughts and prayers. Donations welcome. There were no villains and therefore no heroes. Only fate, which no one could blame. The theater's sponsors, among them Hartwell Enterprises, pledged to improve safety and learn lessons. A committee formed, produced a memo, and adjourned. Meanwhile, investigators disappeared into private meetings and came out with nothing to say. The unofficial story lived where truth tends to, on the staff room couches, in crude text threads, in whispers traded over coffee on Queen Street. People knew about the 3 reports. They knew about the sprinklers offline for maintenance that never quite happened. They knew about the exit blocked because a set piece was too unwieldy to store anywhere else. They knew the line items on a spreadsheet that made the math work that quarter. And they knew whose pen had approved them. But people also knew mortgages and children and the way power can turn a ribcage into a cage. Silence is a survival skill in this city. It was in Isabella's house. Tadachi went home after a month, changed and not. Stitches hid under her hairline. Graphs shone like new country on an old map. Therapists taught her to stretch scars that did not want to be touched. A kind surgeon told her she would dance again in some way, which she heard first as a kindness and then as a sentence. Her father visited the first week with flowers that smelled like a lobby, and with eyes that kept slipping from her face to the window, as if the skyline were making a stronger case. He promised specialists, retreats, the best of everything, and delivered any service that could be purchased. You can stock a house with the world's most expensive mirrors and still learn not to look. She did not return to school. She did not return to the studio where girls glanced at her and then ran to tie their shoes harder, as if speed could ward off tragedy. Invitations to galas continued to arrive for her father, and sometimes for her. Perfumed envelopes begging the presence of a perfect family. She learned the second rule: show up when asked, keep out of frame. Years slipped like beads on a broken string. When the weather was kind, she walked the lakeshore in a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, passing joggers and strollers and tourists who pretended not to stare. When the city was cruel, she hid in second-hand bookstores and read until closing. She thought of dance the way people think of those they've lost, both too much and not enough. Memory hurts because it insists. So she taught her body the art of stillness. But even silence hums with leftover music. Back in the ballroom, the hum returned as a presence. Nathan's thumb rested lightly against her hand, not gripping, just there, as if to say, "I will match your weight." She realized she was breathing like she had on stage, slow in, slow out, a metronome set to survival. The quartet shuffled at their music stands, pages whispering. Claire Thompson Hartwell's coup, woman of immaculate angles and immaculate timing, leaned over the bandleader to confirm the next selection. Nothing sad, the memo had said. Nothing complicated. Nothing that might remind anyone of anything. Across the room, Richard accepted congratulations that sounded like fealty. He was in his element, tread tie the exact shade of decisive, cufflinks that held tiny carves, posture that suggested the city owed him a thank you letter. A camera hovered near his shoulder. Vivian Lee, influencer by trade and anthropologist by instinct, panned slowly for her live stream. She knew how to frame a narrative, light on benefactor, a blur of beneficiaries, tragedy as tasteful texture in the background. Her lens had already found Isabella once. It would again. Nathan did not let go. He did not try to lead her to the center yet, did not make a show. He simply held space the way good partners do and waited for music. Waiting is a form of faith. Isabella felt some small, stubborn part of herself sit up inside her ribs and listen. And then the first notes rose. Not from the quartet they were still conferring, but from the grand piano at the edge of the stage, where a substitute sheet had appeared during the applause like a dare. The melody began in a minor key, a haunting line that tugged at the room's edges and drew them in. Isabella knew it after the second measure, the way a body knows its own name. The waltz from that night, not a copy or a pastiche, but the arrangement, the breath between phrases exactly where her feet remembered it. Someone had smuggled the song past protocol and pity, and placed it like evidence in plain sight, across the ballroom. Richard's smile died before the crowd could see it. He turned toward the piano with a look that had ended careers, markets, marriages. The bandleader glanced to Claire. Claire went still, calculating risk in real time. Vivian's camera climbed to a higher angle, hungry. A tremor traveled through the donor's first curiosity, then recognition, then the delicious dread of watching something they were not supposed to witness. Isabella did not move for 3 beats, 4. On 5 she exhaled, and the breath carried 7 years with it. Nathan felt the shift, something inside her unlocking like a door that had been rusted shut and now, unbelievably, gave. He raised their joined hands a fraction. She stepped. The floor did not swallow her. The chandeliers did not go dark. The room did not laugh. Somewhere behind them, a child squealed softly, a sound quickly shushed Lily. Shirley, and the small, sunlit realism of that noise cut the moment's operatic edge just enough to make it human. Isabella found Nathan's eyes. They were the warm brown of old wood, the kind of color that feels like shelter. "You don't have to be perfect," he said, so quietly only she could hear. "You just have to be you." Her right hand, the one mapped by scars, rose to his shoulder. Her left settled into his palm. The first turn was clumsy, her balance argued with memory, but his frame absorbed the falter and gave it back as grace. The room drew tighter, breath by breath, as if all of Toronto had squeezed into that rectangle of air between their chests. Richard took 2 steps toward the stage, checked himself when 3 cameras swiveled, and chose the microphone instead. "Stop," he said. Not loud yet, but the threat rode under the word like thunder under snow. The piano did not stop. The waltz, once the hymn of her undoing, turned another phrase and offered itself again. Isabella followed, not towards spectacle, not away from fear, but into the precise space where both existed. The secret she had kept like a wound, how the fire started, how the reports were buried, how her father had chosen image over daughter did not disappear in the music. It surfaced, and the city that had looked away for 7 years began, at last, to look. Richard Hartwell did not like surprises. His empire had been built on eliminating them, one contract clause and one safety inspection at a time. Yet tonight, in his own ballroom, a surprise had slipped through the cracks like smoke under a door. The melody swelled from the grand piano, unmistakable now. The waltz from the riverside fire. The music Isabella had last danced to before flames devoured her stage and half her face. Richard's jaw tightened, his smile freezing into the mask he wore whenever cameras were near. He whispered furiously to Dylan Parker, his head of public relations, who typed frantically into his phone as though hashtags and statements could smother the sound. But the music carried, threading through every chandelier crystal until the air itself vibrated with memory. Guests shifted uneasily. Some recognized the tune immediately, their whispers sharp as needles. "Isn't that?" "My God, it is." Others leaned in, scandalized, hungry for the drama money could not buy. Vivian Lee's livestream surged, thousands of hearts and comments exploding across the screen. "What's happening? That's Hartwell's daughter. Is this planned?" On the ballroom floor, Isabella's body betrayed her. 7 years of silence warred against muscle memory that refused to forget. Her shoulders lifted into the opening phrase. Her hips began to find the time. Her feet yearned to trace patterns they had once commanded effortlessly. She hesitated, caught between fear and inevitability. And then Nathan spoke again, so softly only she could hear. "You don't need their permission." The words struck her like fresh oxygen. She let herself lean into his frame. His right hand anchored at her waist, his left guiding hers upward. Together they stepped onto the cleared space at the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted as if obeying some ancient law, scandal and awe colliding in their faces. The servant and the scarred daughter, the waltz and the wound. Richard moved toward the microphone, his control fracturing. "This is inappropriate," he barked, but his voice cracked beneath the chandeliers. Too many cameras, too many eyes. Even Claire Thompson, his meticulous coup, stood frozen, her ever-present tablet dangling at her side as she stared at Isabella's transformation. The first turn was shaky. Isabella's knees nearly buckled, but Nathan absorbed the stumble, turning it into a flourish so graceful that gasps rippled through the crowd. He danced like a man who had nothing to lose but everything to give. He had learned patience in hospital hallways with Amanda, learned steadiness braiding Lily's hair in mornings blurred by exhaustion. Now he gave that steadiness to Isabella, and she bloomed in his arms. Her spine straightened, her arms extended, scars and all, like wings relearning their span. She lifted her chin, exposing the very half of her face she had hidden for years. For a moment, the ballroom saw not the ruined ballerina, not the daughter of shame, but a woman rediscovering herself note by note. The room held its breath. Even Vivian forgot to narrate, her phone trembling as she streamed. Guests who had dismissed Isabella as a hushed tragedy now saw her lit by crystal light, fierce and alive. Some were moved, some horrified, but none could look away. Richard's mask shattered. "Stop this!" He roared into the microphone, his voice magnified across the ballroom. He pointed a trembling hand at Nathan. "You are an employee. You have no right to touch her." And then Isabella did something she had never done in 7 years. She stopped moving, but did not release Nathan's hand. She turned, her eyes locking onto her father's. And when she spoke, her voice carried through the speakers with a strength no one had expected. "I'm tired of asking permission to exist," she said. The crowd gasped as if she had struck him. Vivian's stream lit up, comment after comment exploding like fireworks. She spoke. "Did you hear that? The daughter fights back. This is history." Richard faltered, his cheeks flushing crimson. He had always counted on silencers, the staffs, the cities, but silence had cracked, and now every word carried like thunder. Nathan leaned close to her, his voice for her alone. "Keep dancing. Let them hear it in your steps." And so they did. The waltz rose higher, the rhythm quickening, and Isabella moved with a grace that mocked every whisper, every dismissal, every shadow her father had tried to shove her into. With each turn, she stole the room from him. With each step, she rewrote her story. Richard Hartwell, master of control, watched helplessly as his daughter's defiance turned into beauty. The empire he had built on perfection trembled, not from scandal sheets or boardroom betrayals, but from a single scarred woman daring to dance. And for the first time in his life, Richard knew fear. The music pressed on, weaving its spell, but the ballroom was no longer united in awe. Cracks appeared like fissures on ice. A handful of guests clapped softly, almost involuntarily, swept up by Isabella's fragile rebirth. Others exchanged sharp whispers, scandal radiating through them like heat. Some simply recorded, their phones raised high, desperate to capture a moment that might go viral before dessert was served. Claire Thompson tried to restore order. She moved quickly to the stage, her tablet glowing, whispering frantically to the bandleader. "End the song. Switch the sheet. Anything but this." But when she reached the music stand, her hand froze. There, beside the typed playlist, was a handwritten arrangement, ink smudged, corners dog-eared. It wasn't part of her schedule. She hadn't authorized it. The sight chilled her. Someone had planted this deliberately. Finn O'Connell, the pianist, met her eyes. 35, with the kind of hollow look only broken dreams give. He recognized the piece instantly. He had played it years ago in rehearsal, before the fire silenced everything. His hands hovered over the keys, hesitation clawing at him. But then he looked at Isabella, at her trembling shoulders finding rhythm, at Nathan guiding her with quiet patience, and he knew music, when it mattered, was never about safety. He pressed on louder now, the waltz unfurling with defiance. Richard Hartwell's composure cracked like glass. He surged toward the podium, snatching the microphone. Enough. His voice blasted through the speakers, commanding but edged with desperation. This is a charity gala, not a circus. My daughter is unwell. She does not know what she's doing. Gasps spread like wildfire. He had said it aloud, my daughter, but framed as weakness, as a blemish to be excused. Isabella faltered for half a beat, her eyes closing, her scars illuminated by crystal light. But Nathan's grip steadied her. His voice brushed against her ear. Let them see. Not their version of you. The real you. She opened her eyes again, and in them burned something the fire had not destroyed. She straightened, pulling Nathan back into the dance, her gown sweeping across the marble like a tide reclaiming shore. The crowd could no longer pretend this was a misstep. This was rebellion. Then it happened, her father's fatal mistake. Richard's anger boiled past calculation. He forgot the cameras, forgot Vivian's live stream still broadcasting to thousands. He forgot that microphones magnify not only words but truth. His voice, raw and unfiltered, ripped across the ballroom. That scarred face is an embarrassment. He snarled, every time I look at you, I see my failure. The failure of that theater. The failure of the protocols I approved. I've spent 7 years and millions burying what happened that night, and you insist on parading it for everyone to see. Silence detonated. It wasn't absence of sound, it was a void so total it rang in the bones. The musicians froze mid-phrase. Guests stared in disbelief, hands clamped over mouths. Vivian's live stream numbers spiked like fireworks. In living rooms across Toronto, across Canada, people watching felt their jaws drop as the city's most powerful man confessed not just cruelty, but culpability. Dylan Parker lunged forward, hissing into Richard's ear. The mic, turn it off, for God's sake. But it was too late. The red recording light blinked mercilessly from every phone dot, and then a new voice cut through. From the service entrance, a man stepped into the ballroom. His hair was grayer, his posture stooped, but his presence was unmistakable. Mark Benson, the stage engineer from the Riverside Theater, the man who had filed reports no one had wanted to read. In his hands, a thick folder, pages jetting from its edges like unsheathed blades. I have the reports, Mark said, his voice trembling but clear. Originally mails, safety assessments, budget cuts with your digital signature. Mr. Hartwell, you knew. You signed. You silenced. Gasps turned into shouts. Lawyers' names were whispered. Phones lit up with frantic dialing. Guests who had suffered losses in Hartwell's ventures murmured darkly. Emboldened by the crack in the armor, the empire was bleeding, and sharks smelled blood. Richard staggered, the microphone slipping from his hand, clattering against the stage. His empire wasn't crumbling in secret boardrooms or quiet lawsuits, it was collapsing in real time. Under chandeliers, in front of hundreds, with the whole country watching live. And still, through the chaos, Isabella and Nathan kept moving. Step by step, turn by turn, their dance did not falter. If anything, it grew stronger, sharper. Each pivot carved her father's lies into dust. Each spin said what words could not. You tried to bury me, but I am still here. Finn lifted his hands again, and with tears in his eyes, he played louder than he had in years, as though music itself was testifying. The truth was finally on the floor. And Richard Hartwell, once untouchable, stood at the center of his own gala, watching everything he had built burn not in flames this time, but in the merciless light of revelation. The ballroom had turned into a battlefield. Though no swords were drawn, no fists raised, the weapons here were words, cameras, and the terrible clarity of truth set free. Phones hovered like torches, their red recording lights catching every tremor on Richard Hartwell's face. Every step Isabella took across the marble floor. The music surged higher, and with it, the impossible happened. People began to cheer. Not loud, not unified, but a ripple, an undercurrent, as though courage itself was contagious. Isabella's breath came quick and sharp. Each turn with Nathan carried her farther away from the shadows she had lived in. For years, she had rehearsed the art of disappearing, lowering her chin, tucking her hair to hide scars, stepping back before anyone could notice. But tonight she felt something else stirring anger, yes, but more than that, liberation. She was not shrinking. She was expanding, her body remembering the geometry of movement, her spirit remembering its claim to space. "Look at them," Nathan murmured, his voice low, steady against the roar of silence. "They're seeing you." Not pitying, not whispering, seeing. Her lips trembled, but not with fear. She lifted her chin toward the glittering chandeliers. For the first time since fire had rewritten her body, she welcomed the light. Her gown swept behind her as Nathan guided her into a daring spin. The crowd gasped as she landed perfectly in his arms. Her scarred cheek tilted upward like a banner instead of a burden. Richard could not contain it. He seized another microphone, his fury echoing across the ballroom. "Stop this immediately. You are humiliating yourself, Isabella. You are humiliating our family." The word family struck her harder than any insult. She thought of the 3 years he refused to be photographed with her, of the stories he fed to investors about a chronic illness that explained her absence. She thought of how he had erased her from glossy brochures, company Christmas cards, society pages, each omission a declaration that she was no longer his daughter. Family, in his mouth, was not love. It was ownership. Isabella stopped moving. The music carried on, but her feet froze, her hands still clasped in Nathan's. She turned toward her father, her chest heaving. The ballroom hushed instantly, as if the air itself knew what was about to happen. Her voice rang clear, strong enough to pierce chandeliers and screens alike. "I'm tired of hiding," she said. The words were heavy, yet they lifted her shoulders, straightened her spine. "I'm tired of making myself smaller so you don't have to see what your choices cost. I'm tired of being your shame." The silence that followed was electric. It wasn't absence. It was expectation. Even the live stream comments slowed for a heartbeat. Thousands of strangers leaning closer to their screens. Richard's mask of authority shattered completely. His face mottled with rage, veins standing out along his neck. He tried to speak, but the sound snagged in his throat. Around him, Dylan Parker frantically drafted statements that would never be read. Claire Thompson stared at her useless tablet, and donors exchanged horrified glances. They had come for champagne and prestige. They were witnessing history. Instead, Isabella turned back to Nathan. The waltz still played, and she moved again, not because she was told to, not because it was expected, but because she chose to. Her feet found rhythm, her body found grace. Step after step, she reclaimed not only the dance, but herself. The crowd reacted like a tide shifting. Some clapped in rhythm, softly at first, then louder. A few guests braver than the rest stood. Their applause wasn't for rebellion, wasn't for scandal. It was for survival made visible. For the woman who refused to remain silent, who refused to be hidden. Nathan guided her through another spin, and when she landed this time, it was not as a broken ballerina, but as a phoenix, scarred yet blazing. The room saw it, felt it, and could not deny it. Richard stumbled forward, desperate to regain control, his empire slipping through his fingers. He reached for Nathan's shoulder, intent on dragging him away from Isabella. But Nathan anticipated the move. With elegant precision, he turned Isabella into a graceful pivot that spun her just out of reach, leaving Richard grasping at air. The crowd erupted, some in laughter, some in gasps. The symbolism was undeniable. The servant had outmaneuvered the master. Without ever breaking the dance, Richard's desperation deepened. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted, his voice raw. "You're humiliating yourself, humiliating us all." But even as his words rang, they sounded hollow. The humiliation wasn't Isabella's anymore, it was his. Everyone could see it. The cameras, the live stream. The eyes of 300 witnesses bore down not on the scars of a daughter, but on the fractures of a father, and still Isabella danced. Her face lifted, her scars shining under the chandeliers like a crown forged in fire. The night was no longer Richard's gala. It was hers. The applause that had begun as a ripple was now a storm threatening to sweep the entire room. Guests who had come for polite networking and champagne now found themselves witnesses to the collapse of an empire. Phones tilted higher, catching every angle, every word, every flicker of light on Isabella's scarred face. The livestream comment counts rocketed upward 10,000, 20,000, until it felt as if the whole country was tuned into this ballroom. Watching the Hartwells disintegrate in real time, Richard Hartwell tried to fight the tide. He snatched the microphone again, his voice ragged, furious. "Do not be fooled. This," he gestured wildly toward Nathan and Isabella, "is a stunt, a spectacle staged for attention. This man is nothing but a waiter. He wants money, fame, leverage." His words fell like stones into water, loud at first, then drowned by the current. Because even as he spoke, another voice rose, quieter but far heavier with truth. "I have the reports." All eyes swung toward the service entrance. There, in a plain suit that hung a little loose on his shoulders, stood Mark Benson. The years had lined his face, grayed his hair, but the strength in his stance was unmistakable. In his hands, he carried a folder thick with documents, the edges yellowed, corners bent, each page a scar on paper, original safety assessments, emails, proposals. Every one of them ignored. Every one of them signed by you, Mr. Hartwell. Mark's voice trembled at first, but as he continued, it gained steel. "You knew the theater's wiring was faulty. You knew the sprinklers were offline. You knew the exits were blocked. You cut corners to save money, and you buried my reports when I objected." The ballroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, even screams. Some guests stumbled backward as if the truth itself had weight. Donors clutched at pearls, at glasses, at excuses. Others seized their phones not to film but to call lawyers, board members, journalists. Richard staggered, pale now, his fury boiling into panic. "Baseless," he shouted. "You have no proof." Mark lifted the folder, pages fanning like a judge's gavel. "Every page has your signature." Vivian Lee zoomed her camera in, her live stream catching the detail. Richard's digital initials at the bottom of every damning document. Within seconds, screenshots flooded Twitter and Instagram. Hashtags birthing themselves faster than Richard could deny them. Hashtag Hartwell exposed. Hashtag scared but strong. Hashtag gala of truth. Dylan Parker pressed himself against a wall, typing furiously, whispering into his headset to colleagues outside. Claire Thompson, usually a fortress of composure, stood frozen, her face drained of blood. Even she knew damage control was no longer possible. The guests turned restless, a crowd sensing collapse. Some had lost fortunes to Hartwell Ventures. Others had seen careers destroyed in his wake. Now, with his armor cracking, voices rose. "He ruined my father's business. He buried my cousin's case. He lied about the inspections at Harborfront Tower." One by one, stories bubbled to the surface like bodies rising in a flood. Richard stumbled toward Mark, hand outstretched as if to seize the folder. But Nathan pivoted, still holding Isabella, and their dance intercepted him once more. Isabella spun, her gown cutting a swath of blue silk between her father and the truth. The move wasn't violent, it was elegant, devastating in its symbolism. The daughter he had tried to erase now shielded the man who carried proof of his guilt. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Some even applauded. The room's allegiance was shifting, not with words, but with rhythm, not with power, but with courage. "Don't do this." Richard's voice cracked, desperation spilling through. "You're destroying everything." Isabella stopped mid-turn. The music carried on, but she faced him, her scars glowing under the chandeliers. "No, Father," she said, each syllable clear. "You destroyed everything. I'm just showing them the ashes you tried to hide." The ballroom fell silent again. Even Finn O'Connell at the piano played softer, as if giving space for her words to echo. Richard swayed where he stood, suddenly smaller, diminished under the weight of eyes and evidence. For the first time in his life, he had no script, no statement, no shield of perfection to hide behind. And in that silence, Isabella turned back to Nathan. The music rose again, steady, insistent. Together they danced not as fugitives, not as victims, but as witnesses to truth. Each step was an indictment. Each spin was a revelation. The empire of Richard Hartwell was collapsing not in boardrooms, not in secret settlements, but here under chandeliers and live stream cameras. as his daughter danced with the man who had dared to see her dot, and for the first time in 7 years, Isabella did not feel like tragedy. She felt like fire burning, yes, but alive. The waltz surged toward its final crescendo, and Isabella felt every note resonate through bone and scar. Around her, the ballroom was no longer a cage of whispers, but an arena where truth had taken the stage. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes fixed on her, some in awe, some in shame, some in vindication. For once, she didn't shrink beneath them. She let them look. She wanted them to. The last chord thundered from the piano, but Finn O'Connell did not let his hands fall. Instead, he shifted seamlessly into an improvised coda, giving the moment room to breathe. Isabella slowed with Nathan, turning one final time beneath the chandeliers. When she stopped, she did not bow, did not retreat. She stood tall, scars illuminated, gown pooling at her feet, as though the very fire that had once consumed her now lit her from within. Silence held for a heartbeat, two, and then applause, tentative at first. A single clap from the back of the room. Another joined, and another. Within seconds, the ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. Not for Richard, not for his empire, for Isabella, who had refused to hide, for the courage carved into her skin. Richard's face drained of color. He staggered, drowning in the sound of a crowd he could no longer command. His phone buzzed again and again. Directors, investors, journalists demanding explanations. He did not answer. For the first time in his life, his silence was not control, but defeat. Isabella turned to the cameras, to the endless rows of phones pointed at her like mirrors. Her voice carried across the room, steady, unwavering. This is my face. These are my scars, and I will dance. Not for perfection, not for appearances, for survival. For everyone who has been told to hide so others can stay comfortable. We are not your shame. We are not your failure. We are here. We deserve to be seen. The ovation grew louder, swelling until it rattled the chandeliers. Vivian Lee's live stream nearly crashed under the weight of comments. She's a hero. This changes everything. Scarred but strong. By morning, the clip would be replayed on every news station in Canada. Then across the world, Lily broke free from her aunt's grip and ran onto the marble floor. Her small arms wrapped around Isabella's waist, her head pressing against the midnight blue gown. The contrast, child's innocence against survivor's scars, was breathtaking. From her pocket, Lily pulled out the tiny music box her father carried. She wound the key, and a simple lullaby tinkled into the vast ballroom. The same melody Isabella had just danced to, stripped down to fragile, childlike notes. Mommy said music makes everything better, Lily whispered. You can keep it. Tears blurred Isabella's vision as she knelt, pressing her scarred cheek against the little girl's smooth one. Thank you, she whispered. And for the first time in 7 years, the word did not feel like surrender. It felt like grace. By dawn, the story had spread like wildfire. 10 million views became 20. Investigations launched. Richard was suspended by his board. His empire dissected by journalists, uncovering every buried report, every silenced voice. Claire Thompson announced sweeping reforms, a victims' compensation fund, and in a stunning move, offered Mark Benson the new role of Chief of Safety Compliance. But the heart of the story was not Richard's fall. It was Isabella's rise. 3 days later, in a modest studio on Montreal's East Side, Isabella met with Astrid Cole, the artistic director who had once trained her. Astrid admitted she had slipped the forbidden sheet music onto the stand, driven by guilt and hope. She offered Isabella a teaching position not out of pity, but because talent does not burn away. Isabella accepted, tears streaking her face, her reflection in the mirror no longer unbearable. Over the weeks, life rearranged. Nathan began working part-time at the studio, managing sound equipment, sometimes playing piano for classes. Lily enrolled in Isabella's beginner ballet course, her clumsy leaps sparking laughter and joy. For the first time, Isabella found herself not haunted by the past, but building a future. Step by step, Richard, disgraced and under investigation, eventually stood outside one of her classes, older, grayer. His posture bent under a weight no wealth could lift. He did not demand, did not excuse. He simply whispered, I see you. It was not forgiveness. But it was a beginning. 1 year later, the Riverside Theater reopened. The marble floors gleamed, the exits stood clear. Sprinklers gleamed overhead, every safety measure overseen by Mark Benson. At center stage stood Isabella, not hiding, not painted in makeup to cover her scars. Nathan sat at the piano, Lily in the front row clutching her music box. The first notes of a new composition filled the era song Nathan had written in sleepless nights. Called Phoenix Waltz. Isabella danced, not to erase what had happened, not to become who she once was, but to honor who she had become. Every scar shimmered under the lights, not as shame, but as survival, not as ruin, but as proof. The audience rose to their feet, the ovation rolling for 7 full minutes, one for every year she had hidden. Backstage afterward, Lily hugged her tightly. "How was it?" Isabella asked, kneeling to her height. Lily thought, then grinned. "Not perfect, better than perfect, real." And Isabella laughed, a sound foreign for too long. Now as natural as breath. Outside, rain tapped gently on the theater's new roof. The city alive with stories. Some would call it scandal, others redemption. But Isabella knew better. This wasn't happily ever after. It was something stronger. It was honestly ever after. Scars included, shame excluded.